Imagine this. You board a plane, exhausted but relieved to finally be heading home. You paid for your seat. You followed every rule. You did everything right. But from the moment you step on that aircraft, someone decides you don't belong. Not because of what you did, not because of how you act, but because of your skin. Meet Walter Langston, a quiet, dignified black man in his late 60s, his body frail from months of chemotherapy. A man who spent his life building a legacy, only to be treated like he was nothing the moment he set foot on Flight 207. And meet Amanda Jacobs, the flight attendant who looked at Walter and saw nothing more than an inconvenience. She had the power to make his life easier, to help him through a difficult journey. Instead, she chose to starve him, humiliate him, and strip away his dignity, piece by piece. What Amanda didn't know, Walter wasn't just any passenger. And by the time this flight landed, she would regret every single second of it. This is more than just a story. It's a reminder that power means nothing when justice is watching. If you believe in standing up against injustice, hit that like button. If you've ever witnessed discrimination firsthand, share your experience in the comments. And if you don't want to miss stories that expose the truth, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The moment Walter Langston stepped onto the aircraft, Amanda knew she had found her target. Dressed in a loose gray sweater and slacks that hung from his frail frame, his pale skin and sunken eyes bore the unmistakable marks of chemotherapy. Amanda, who had spent years perfecting the art of masking contempt beneath a polished smile, didn't even bother this time. She offered warm greetings to the well-dressed business travelers and socialites boarding first class. But when Walter stopped the entrance, gripping his ticket with slightly trembling fingers, her lips barely moved. "Are you sure you're on the right flight, sir?" Her voice, coated in saccharine politeness, carried just enough condescension for nearby passengers to pick up on it. Walter blinked, startled. "Excuse me." Amanda let out a small, insincere laugh. "Oh, no offense. It's just that this is a very premium flight experience. We don't usually have." She paused, her eyes flickering over his frail body before finishing with a knowing smirk. "First-time flyers in this section." A few passengers glanced at Walter, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild discomfort. Some looked away, unwilling to engage in whatever was unfolding. Walter cleared his throat. "I've flown more times than I can count," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to my seat." Amanda's smile thinned. She stepped aside, but her eyes followed him with a sharpness that hinted at trouble ahead. Walter found his assigned seat, for C, near the aisle, chosen specifically for ease of movement given his condition. He carefully placed his small carry-on beneath the seat in front of him, exhaling as he settled in. Flying wasn't the challenge, his body was. He needed quick access to the restroom, space to stretch his aching legs, and minimal disruption. Amanda, however, had other plans. With a theatrical sigh, she sauntered over, dramatically glancing at the seating chart on her tablet. "Oh, dear," she murmured, just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "There seems to be an issue with seating assignments." Walter looked up, confused. "Issue?" She nodded sympathetically. "Fake, exaggerated. It looks like there's been a mix-up. Someone with higher priority needs this seat, and I'll have to move you." Walter's brows furrowed. "I booked this seat specifically. I checked it on time. There shouldn't be any mix-up." Amanda tilted her head, her voice syrupy sweet, but her eyes gleaming with something cruel. "I understand, sir, but unfortunately, priority passengers must be accommodated first." Before he could protest, she plucked his boarding pass from his lap, tapped a few buttons on her tablet, and handed him a new assignment. "Don't worry, we have another seat for you. 22F, right at the back, near the lavatories, so if you need anything, you won't have far to go." Walter's grip tightened around the ticket. "This is economy." Amanda shrugged, pretending to be sympathetic. "I wish I could help, but these things happen when seating adjustments are required." Passengers nearby exchanged glances. A few shifted uncomfortably, sensing something wasn't right, but no one spoke up. Walter felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him, the familiar, bitter taste of humiliation creeping in. He knew this game. He had seen it play out in different forms throughout his life. The small, calculated injustices, the unspoken rules that allowed people like Amanda to wield power in subtle, but deeply cutting ways. He could fight it, cause a scene, but at what cost? After a long pause, he exhaled slowly and stood, gripping the seat for support. His knees protested as he pushed himself upright. But he kept his head high. "Enjoy the seat," he muttered under his breath as he turned and made his way down the aisle, his frailty on full display for the passengers who pretended not to see. Amanda watched him go, satisfaction curling at the edges of her lips. Another one put in his place. As Walter reached row 22, he inhaled sharply. The seat assigned to him was wedged between two oversized passengers, barely leaving enough room for him to breathe comfortably. The stench of the nearby lavatories wafted toward him, and with every slight turbulence, the rattling of the plane echoed in the tight, cramped space. He lowered himself into the seat, his body already aching. His fingers hovered over his phone, debating whether to text someone, maybe his lawyer, maybe his daughter. But then, he simply let it rest in his lap. The air around him was thick with a lingering smell of the lavatories, and each sudden jolt of turbulence sent a nauseating ripple through his already fragile body. He folded his hands in his lap, staring at the seat back in front of him, trying to block out the faint murmurs of disapproving passengers still glancing in his direction. He could feel their pity, their discomfort, but most of all, their indifference. The flight had settled into routine. First-class passengers reclined luxuriously in their spacious seats, sipping champagne, as the flight attendants began their meal service. The scent of freshly prepared dishes drifted through the air, a cruel reminder that Walter hadn't eaten since early that morning. Down the aisle, Amanda moved with practiced ease, her tray of meals gliding between passengers as she handed out plates with perfectly curated smiles. A glass of chilled white wine for the woman in 3A, a sizzling steak for the executive in 2C. The clinking of cutlery and hushed murmurs of satisfaction filled the cabin. Walter watched, waiting patiently. The minutes ticked by. Rows ahead, flight attendants delivered meals to every passenger in first class, then moved on to business, then premium economy. Trays of food were passed, hands reaching, mouths thanking, the casual rhythm of an airline's well-oiled machine. Walter's row? Ignored. His stomach twisted as his eyes followed Amanda, who busied herself serving passengers with the air of someone who had completely forgotten he existed. He cleared his throat, careful to keep his voice even. "Excuse me." Amanda turned, her brows lifting as if she had just noticed him. "Oh," she said, feigning surprise. "Something wrong?" Walter kept his expression neutral. "I believe I was supposed to receive a meal." Amanda blinked, tilting her head. "Oh, that's strange. You didn't pre-order a special meal?" Walter hesitated. "No, but I assumed." Amanda let out a small, knowing laugh. "Ah, that's the problem, then. You assumed." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if letting him in on a secret. "See, special accommodations need to be arranged ahead of time. Most first-class passengers know that." Walter gritted his teeth, keeping his composure. "I didn't request anything special, just the standard meal." Amanda let out a dramatic sigh. "That's the thing, Mr. Langston. We prepare a limited number of meals for each class. If you were still in your original seat, of course, you'd have received one. But now," she gave a small shrug, "there just aren't any extras left." Walter stared at her, his stomach a pit of hunger and quiet rage. Around him, passengers chewed obliviously, forks scraping against porcelain plates. A younger flight attendant, Grace, hovered nearby, watching the exchange with an uneasy expression. She had noticed Amanda skipping Walter during meal service, had seen the deliberate way she passed him over. Now, she hesitated before stepping forward. "Actually, we have a few extra meals," she said cautiously. "I can bring one." Amanda's eyes flashed. "No need," she interrupted, her voice cool but sharp. "We have to be mindful of food waste, Grace." Grace blinked. But Amanda turned back to Walter, her smile still perfectly in place. "You know how it is, Mr. Langston. Airline food isn't always the best anyway. And with your condition, well, I've heard chemo patients have unpredictable appetites." She pouted, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Wouldn't want you to waste a perfectly good meal, right?" A few passengers glanced over now, sensing the deliberate cruelty in her tone. Grace shifted uncomfortably, but Amanda shot her a warning look. Walter exhaled slowly. He could feel his pulse in his temples, the exhaustion creeping into his bones. He had endured worse than this. But something about Amanda's smirk, her utter confidence in her power, set his teeth on edge. He straightened in his seat. "I'll take whatever's available." Amanda hesitated for the briefest second before letting out a soft chuckle. "I'm afraid there's nothing left." A full lie. Walter's stomach clenched, but he refused to let her see the anger in his eyes. Instead, he simply nodded once. "Of course." Amanda lingered, as if expecting more of a reaction. When he didn't give it to her, she hummed under her breath and turned away. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said over her shoulder. Grace shot Walter an apologetic look before following Amanda down the aisle. Walter sat back in his seat, fingers curling into the armrest. He had seen people like Amanda before. They thrived on control, on pushing boundaries just enough to make others suffer while keeping their hands technically clean. Amanda strutted down the aisle, an air of smugness in her step, clearly emboldened by how easy it was to push him around without consequence. She was basking in the power of her unspoken authority, the kind that allowed people like her to break someone down without ever lifting a finger. Walter pressed the call button. It was a simple request: water. Nothing more. His throat was dry, and his body, already running on fumes, needed even the smallest relief. Amanda turned at the sound of the ding and let out an exaggerated sigh before sauntering over. "Again," she drawled, placing a hand on her hip. "What is it now?" Walter ignored the condescension in her voice. "A glass of water, please." Amanda cocked her head, pretending to consider it. "Are you sure?" she asked, eyes twinkling with something cruel. "Because, dehydration is common for people in your condition. Maybe you should have planned better." A few passengers nearby glanced up from their phones, sensing something off, but none of them spoke. Walter didn't flinch. "Water," he repeated. Amanda smirked. "Of course, Mr. Langston. Right away." She turned on her heel and disappeared toward the galley, taking her time making sure Walter felt every second of the wait. When she finally returned, she held a plastic cup filled to the brim with ice-cold water. Walter reached out to take it, but just as his fingers brushed the cup, it slipped. Or rather, Amanda let it slip. The water splashed onto his lap, the ice bouncing off his trembling hands and hitting the floor with a sharp clatter. A silence stretched over the surrounding passengers, a few of them inhaling sharply. Amanda gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. "Oh no," she exclaimed, her voice high-pitched with fake innocence. "I am so sorry, Mr. Langston. You must be so weak from, that you couldn't hold it properly." Walter inhaled through his nose, slow and deep. The coldness seeped through his thin clothes, but it wasn't nearly as sharp as the humiliation pressing down on him. Amanda grabbed a few napkins from her apron and tossed them onto his tray table. "Here you go," she said sweetly. "Might as well get some movement in and clean up a little, huh?" Walter's fingers twitched around the armrest, but he didn't react. That, of course, only made Amanda bolder. She leaned down, her voice dropping just for him. "I don't know why you even bothered flying, old man," she whispered, the saccharine tone barely masking her disdain. "People like you. Well, let's just say first class was never going to be your place, and I think you know that." Walter finally looked at her then. Really looked. And for the first time, Amanda hesitated. There was no anger in his face, no visible frustration. Just a quiet, unsettling patience. That made her nervous. But before she could dwell on it, she straightened and turned to walk away. She wasn't done yet. As she passed a well-dressed man sitting across the aisle, she leaned down conspiratorially. "Between us," she murmured just loud enough, You might want to keep your distance. I mean, look at him, so sickly. Who knows what he's carrying?" The man shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Walter, at the wet stain on his lap, at his thinning skin, and suddenly, a shadow of doubt crept into his eyes. Amanda knew that reaction well. It was the same unspoken disgust that people had when they saw something they didn't understand, when they saw weakness. It worked. A woman seated next to Walter shifted subtly toward the window, increasing the space between them. Another passenger adjusted their mask, suddenly hyper-aware of the man sitting just a few feet away. Walter saw it all. Amanda, satisfied, turned away, humming under her breath as she continued down the aisle. Walter could feel the stiffness in his legs turning into something more dangerous. Pain, tightness. He needed to move. Slowly, he reached for the armrest and pushed himself up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his knee. Just a short walk to the lavatory, just enough to stretch, to relieve the mounting pressure in his joints. He barely took 2 steps before a figure stepped directly in front of him. Amanda's arms were crossed, her stance deliberate, blocking his path like a gatekeeper deciding who was worthy of passage. Walter looked up at her, his exhaustion making his voice thinner than he wanted. "Excuse me." Amanda tilted her head, her lips curling into something almost amused. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said. Walter frowned, gripping the seat beside him for balance. "I just need to use the restroom." Amanda let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head. "Mr. Langston, I really think you should stay seated. I mean, what if something happens? You don't look too steady on your feet." She gave an exaggerated glance around, making sure nearby passengers were listening. "What if you collapse? Who's going to catch you?" Walter swallowed the heat rising in his chest. "I'll be fine." Amanda didn't move. Instead, she leaned in just a little, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I don't think you get it," she said, her words slow, measured. "You're a liability. If you fall, if something happens to you, guess who's responsible?" She placed a hand over her chest. "Me. And I really don't need the paperwork." Walter clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around the seat. Amanda sighed dramatically again, then gave him a pitying look. "Tell you what, why don't you just wait until the next beverage service? I'll be happy to bring you some more water." She smirked. "If you can hold on to it this time." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, overhearing just enough to understand what was happening. But just like before, no one intervened. Walter forced himself to nod. He wasn't going to win this. Not yet. Amanda smiled, sickly sweet. "Good choice." Then, just like that, she turned and walked off, leaving him stranded in the aisle. Walter exhaled shakily and lowered himself back into his seat. His fingers twitched against his knee, trying to massage away the pain settling deep into his bones. The humiliation burned more than the discomfort. Minutes passed, then more. The beverage cart rattled down the aisle, Amanda pushing it with exaggerated enthusiasm, chatting and laughing with passengers, as if she hadn't just spent the last hour making Walter's life a living hell. When she reached his row, her grin widened. "Thirsty, Mr. Langston?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock kindness. Walter hesitated, but his throat was still dry. "Yes," he said simply. Amanda hummed under her breath, reaching for a small plastic cup. But instead of passing it to him, she pushed the cart forward just a little too forcefully. Walter barely had time to react before the hard metal edge slammed into his hand, crushing it between the cart and the armrest. A sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped him. Amanda gasped theatrically, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh no," she whispered, eyes wide with fake concern. "Did I hit you?" Walter pulled his hand back, his knuckles throbbing. A thin line of redness was already forming where the edge of the cart had scraped against his skin. Amanda let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. "You really are fragile, aren't you?" She didn't wait for an answer, simply poured a few inches of water into a cup and set it down on his tray table. "Here you go. Careful this time." She moved on before he could say anything. Walter flexed his fingers, watching the way they trembled slightly. The pain in his joints, the aching in his legs, the exhaustion pooling in his bones, it was all building. Walter felt the first warning signs before the real damage set in, a slight tremor in his fingers, the dull throb of a headache forming at the base of his skull. He knew his body well enough to recognize the signs: low blood sugar. It was manageable if he took his medication. His hands moved to the small bag tucked under his seat, fingers fumbling for the familiar bottle of pills. But when he unzipped the pocket, it was empty. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He checked again, slower this time, patting down the sides of the bag, reaching into his pockets, but the medication was gone. His breathing quickened. It had been there when he boarded. He was sure of it. He looked up, scanning the cabin, and then he saw her. Amanda stood a few feet away, sipping from a glass of red wine like she didn't have a single concern in the world. Walter's pulse pounded in his ears as he forced himself to speak. "My medication. It's missing." Amanda turned, eyes wide with mock surprise. "Oh." She took a slow sip, savoring the taste before continuing. "That's unfortunate. Are you sure you didn't misplace it?" Walter clenched his jaw. "I always keep it in my bag." Amanda sighed, setting her glass down on a nearby tray. "Well, things do have a way of getting lost on flights. You know, turbulence, people moving bags around." She gave him a slow, amused glance. "And let's be honest, at your age, memory isn't always reliable, is it?" Walter's fingers curled into fists. His body was betraying him, and she knew it. Amanda took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I mean, it's not like anyone would steal it. What would we even do with what was it? Blood pressure meds? Something for your nerves?" Her smirk deepened. "Maybe it's fate telling you it's time to let nature take its course." Walter's chest tightened, not just from rage, but from the telltale weakness creeping into his limbs. He needed that medicine. Now, he reached up and pressed the call button, his breaths coming faster now. Amanda sighed theatrically. "Oh, come on. Don't be dramatic." A younger flight attendant, Grace, rushed over, noticing the distress on Walter's face. "Sir, is everything okay?" Walter opened his mouth, but Amanda cut in before he could speak. "He lost something, but I'm sure it'll turn." No need to panic." Walter's vision blurred at the edges. He swallowed hard, willing himself to stay in control. "I need my medication," he managed. Grace frowned, her gaze flickering to Amanda. "If it's serious, we should check with the flight crew." Amanda rolled her eyes. "It's not serious," she snapped. Then, with a forced smile, she gestured toward Walter's shaking hands. "Honestly, some people just get anxious flying. It happens all the time." Walter gripped the armrest, his breathing shallow. A passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged woman, noticed his pale complexion and whispered to her husband. Another man in business class craned his neck, clearly uneasy. But no one stepped in. Grace hesitated, clearly torn. Walter tried again. "Please." Amanda clapped her hands together like she had just thought of something brilliant. "Oh, you know what might help?" She turned to Grace, smiling. "Why don't we get him some juice? That should do the trick." Grace blinked. "But if it's his medication, juice," Amanda repeated, her tone firm, her smile never fading. Walter's head was spinning now. His body needed the medication, but his vision was getting hazy, his limbs growing heavier. Grace, visibly unsure, nodded and rushed off to grab the juice. Amanda leaned down, her lips close to Walter's ear. "See how easy it is?" she whispered. "You're nothing here, just an old man taking up space." Walter barely registered the words. His head slumped slightly to the side, his fingers twitching weakly against the armrest. Amanda straightened and turned away as if nothing had happened. Behind her, a woman finally reached for her own call button, concern evident in her expression. But before anyone could react further, Amanda casually stepped in front of her, blocking her from view. "Relax," she told the concerned passenger in a hushed tone. "If he's really that sick, he shouldn't be flying in the first place." The woman hesitated. Amanda gave her a knowing look, tilting her head toward Walter's slumped form. "I mean, you wouldn't want him passing out next to you, would you?" That tiny seed of doubt, of fear, was all it took. The woman slowly retracted her hand from a call button. Amanda smirked. She was still in control. Walter's body gave out before his mind could. The weakness had been creeping in for hours, gnawing at his muscles, draining what little strength he had left. He had endured hunger, exhaustion, and humiliation, but now his body was making the choice for him. His fingers twitched uncontrollably, his head lolled forward, and his breath came in short, uneven gasps. A violent tremor ran through his frame, and then he slumped completely. A woman across the aisle let out a sharp gasp, knocking over her drink as she shot forward in her seat. "Oh my God, he's shaking. Somebody help him." The sound cut through the low hum of the plane, snapping passengers out of their detached disinterest. Murmurs turned to shouts as heads whipped around. A businessman near the front stood halfway, uncertain whether to intervene. Someone hit their call button repeatedly, the sharp ding-ding-ding clashing against the rising panic. Amanda remained exactly where she was, arms crossed, weight shifted lazily onto one foot, watching the chaos unfold with the detached amusement of someone utterly unaffected. She glanced at Walter's trembling body, then at the passengers frantically calling for help. And then, with a quiet chuckle, she smirked. "Well, that took longer than I thought," she muttered under her breath. A man near the emergency exit turned on her, his face twisted in disbelief. "Are you serious? He could be dying." Amanda raised a brow. "And? Not my fault he got on this plane looking like a stiff breeze could take him out." She let out a sigh and scanned the cabin. "All right, fine. Any doctors here?" She didn't even try to sound urgent. Passengers glanced around, hesitant. Some shifted uncomfortably but didn't move. Others pressed their call buttons, hoping someone else would fix the situation. Grace, the younger flight attendant, pushed past a row of stunned passengers and rushed toward Walter. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Her hands shook slightly as she knelt beside him, fingers fumbling to check his pulse. She turned sharply toward Amanda. "We need the medical kit now." Amanda scoffed. "For what? A miracle?" She gestured vaguely toward Walter's lymph form. "Hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but when they get like this, it's usually just..." She gave a dramatic pause, then shrugged. "Game over." A thick, horrified silence settled over the nearest passengers. The woman who had first screamed looked ready to slap her. A younger man in a suit stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What the hell is wrong with you? He's still alive." Amanda let out a slow, theatrical sigh. "Oh, relax. You all ignored him for the last 5 hours, but now suddenly you care." She rolled her eyes and gave a lazy wave of her hand. "Fine, let's go through the motions. Someone get him some juice or whatever." Grace's jaw tightened. He doesn't need juice. He needs his medication. And he doesn't have it because... Her breath hitched, realization dawning. She turned to Amanda, her face pale. "Did you take it?" Amanda's smirk twitched, but she recovered quickly. "Don't be ridiculous. Why would I need some old man's meds?" Walter let out a barely audible groan, his body twitching again. Grace reached for his collar, adjusting it to make him more comfortable. And then she froze. Her fingers had brushed against something small, cool, and hard. That was a tiny lens, a camera. Amanda saw the shift in her expression, the way Grace's hand stilled. Her smile finally slipped. "What?" she snapped. Grace barely breathed. Walter had been recording. The whole time. Grace's heart pounded as she stared at the tiny, near-invisible lens embedded in Walter's shirt. It was sleek, professional, not something a sick old man just happened to have on him. Her fingers trembled as she pulled back, eyes flicking between Walter's barely moving form and Amanda, who was now dead silent. Amanda had played this game too many times before, humiliating, degrading, belittling passengers who she thought couldn't fight back. But this time, someone had been watching. And now, they had proof. Amanda's mouth opened, then shut again. For the first time since the flight began, the smug amusement in her eyes cracked into something else, something closer to fear. But she recovered quickly, straightening her posture, plastering on a fake, syrupy sweet smile. "Oh, dear," she gasped, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "I didn't realize he was in such bad shape. We should, call the captain, right? Maybe request a medical emergency landing." She turned toward Grace, tilting her head. That's standard procedure, isn't it? A sharp, disbelieving laugh came from the front of the cabin. A man in a tailored suit, one of the first-class passengers who had been quietly observing this whole time, pushed back his seat and stood. He was recording, and he wasn't the only one. Amanda's breath hitched as she turned, scanning the cabin. More than 5 phones were out, some passengers holding them openly, others keeping them low, but all pointed at her. She had spent hours degrading Walter, acting like the plane was her kingdom, and he was nothing more than an inconvenience. But now, the world was watching. Her eyes darted back to the man in the suit, his camera still trained on her. Hey, she stammered, you can't just record crew members like that. It's against policy, kind of like refusing a sick man medical attention, the man shot back. His voice boomed through the cabin, igniting a spark that turned into fire. Another passenger, an older woman near the window, spoke up, her voice shaking with anger. We saw you, miss. We saw everything. Someone in the back yelled. She let him suffer for hours, and now she's pretending to care. A younger woman raised her phone. This is already live. Thousands of people are watching. Amanda's face drained of color. Grace felt it happen. This shift. The way the air crackled with something new, something Amanda had never faced before. Real, undeniable. Accountability. For hours, Amanda had been in control. But now she was just another abuser caught in the act. A businessman in the front reached for the intercom. His voice was steel. If this airline won't do something, then we will. Amanda could feel it. This shift. The loss of control. It was slipping through her fingers, unraveling faster than she could stop it. The chaos in the cabin had swelled beyond her reach. The passengers were no longer just angry. They were furious. Phones were recording. Faces were twisted in disgust. Whispered accusations turned into outright shouts. Someone had already contacted customer service mid-flight, and another was on a call with what sounded like a news station. This was getting out of hand. Amanda turned sharply toward Grace, forcing a saccharine smile onto her lips. Grace, sweetie, why don't you? But Grace wasn't looking at her anymore. Her gaze was locked onto something else. Amanda followed her line of sight, her stomach twisting as she saw the lead flight attendant, Michelle, storming down the aisle. Michelle never rushed. She was always composed, always professional. But now, her face was pale, her expression tight, her hands clenched at her sides. She walked straight past the commotion, past the passengers demanding answers, and stopped in front of Amanda. Then she leaned in. We have a problem, Michelle whispered. But her voice shook. Amanda forced a laugh, still pretending she had some control. Oh, really? You mean the one where a bunch of passengers are overreacting because some old guy? Michelle's hand shot out, gripping Amanda's wrist. Hard. Amanda froze. You idiot, Michelle hissed. Do you even know who he is? Amanda blinked. What? Michelle inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, Walter Langston is the sole heir of the Langston Group. Amanda didn't move, didn't blink. Her mind short-circuited. The Langston Group, Michelle continued, her voice edged with panic, owns this airline. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. The blood drained from her face so fast she felt lightheaded. No, she whispered. Michelle's grip tightened. Yes. Amanda turned, her movements slow, mechanical, as she looked back toward Walter. He hadn't moved much. His body was still slumped, his breathing faint, his face drained of color. But he wasn't dead. And the recording device on his shirt? Still running. The heir to the airline had been sitting in economy class. He had been starved, mocked, humiliated by her. And it had been broadcasted live. Passengers were still watching her. The businessman in the front, the one who had grabbed the intercom, was already sending the footage to a news outlet. The woman near the window was on a video call with a reporter. Amanda's hands trembled. She turned back to Michelle, panic finally breaking through. We can fix this, right? I mean, we land in an hour. Michelle's face was grim. We're not fixing anything. A sharp beep sounded from her crew earpiece. Michelle pressed a finger to it, listening intently. Amanda swallowed hard, waiting. Then Michelle looked back at her, eyes filled with something between pity and absolute terror. "The CEO just called," she said. Her voice was barely audible over the murmuring passengers, over the tension thick in the air. They saw the footage. Amanda's stomach lurched. "The decision's already made," Michelle continued, stepping back like she didn't even want to be near her anymore. "When we land," she hesitated, then delivered the final blow. "You're done." Amanda staggered back, hitting a seat. "No," she breathed. Her chest tightened, her breath coming fast and sharp. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But Michelle was already turning away, speaking into her earpiece. "The order's confirmed. Amanda Jacobs is terminated effective immediately. Security will remove her from the aircraft upon landing." Amanda's vision blurred. She could hear the whispers, turning into outright cheers. A man in the back, one who had been filming since the beginning, let out a slow, mocking whistle. "Damn," he mused. "This is better than a movie." A woman laughed. "I hope they drag her out in handcuffs." Amanda whirled around. The rage, the humiliation, the utter terror clawed up her throat like bile. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "I work for this airline. I have rights." Michelle didn't even glance back. Not anymore. Walter, barely conscious, hadn't moved. But he didn't have to, because now everyone else was moving for him. And Amanda, she had nowhere left to run. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the atmosphere inside was unlike any normal landing. No one rushed to unbuckle their seatbelts or reach for their luggage. Instead, the entire cabin sat still, waiting. The whispers that had been spreading throughout the flight had turned into a low, rumbling tension. Passengers clutched their phones, refreshing news feeds, checking social media, waiting for the moment to unfold. Amanda sat stiffly in her jump seat, her fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the low hum of the plane's engine. She had spent years on flights like this, walking through aisles with the confidence of someone untouchable. But now, she felt like a prisoner waiting for her sentence. The moment the plane came to a full stop, a voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Security personnel will be boarding the aircraft shortly." A ripple of anticipation ran through the cabin. Amanda's breathing turned shallow as she saw two uniformed security officers step onto the plane. They didn't look around. They didn't hesitate. They walked straight toward her. One of them, a tall man with a hardened expression, stopped in front of her and spoke in a clipped, formal tone. "Amanda Jacobs, you are being removed from this flight by order of the airline's executive office. Please stand and come with us immediately." Amanda's throat tightened as a suffocating silence settled over the cabin. She turned sharply toward Michelle, her eyes wild with desperation. "You can fix this," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've worked here for 10 years. You know me." Michelle didn't even spare her a glance. Without a word, she turned and disappeared toward the front of the aircraft. Amanda's hands trembled as she turned back to the security officers. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You can't just miss, do not resist," the second officer warned, his voice firm but emotionless. Amanda's breath came faster as she glanced around, hoping, praying, that someone would defend her. But instead, she saw passengers watching her with a mix of disgust and satisfaction. Some had their phones out, recording every second of her downfall. A businessman near the front smirked as he leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Not so fun when you're the one being humiliated." "Huh." A woman in the middle row scoffed. "Karma's a beautiful thing." Someone else muttered, "Make sure you get a good angle. This needs to go viral." Amanda's stomach twisted painfully as she realized there was no escape from this. She had spent the entire flight tearing someone down, and now she was the one being dragged through the dirt. One of the officers reached for her arm, and she yanked it back. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice cracking. "You people are ridiculous." He was just an old man. It's not like I killed him." A sharp, humorless laugh came from the back of the plane. "Maybe not, but you sure as hell tried." The officer didn't wait any longer. He grabbed her arm firmly and pulled her up from her seat. She thrashed against his grip, but it was useless. The murmurs turned into outright laughter as she was forced down the aisle, her feet stumbling over themselves as she fought against the inevitable. The businessman from earlier called after her. "I hope you enjoy flying economy. Oh wait, you're banned." A woman whistled loudly. "Smile, sweetheart. You're famous now." Amanda clenched her jaw as she was pulled toward the exit, her face burning with humiliation. The last thing she saw before being dragged out was Walter, still weak, still pale, but finally resting as Grace adjusted the oxygen mask over his face. Unlike her, he had nothing left to fear. As the cabin doors shut behind her, the entire plane erupted into applause. Amanda barely had time to process the humiliation of being dragged off the plane before she was thrown into a bigger nightmare. The moment her feet touched the ground, 2 more uniformed officers stepped forward. One of them, a stern-looking woman with a badge clipped to her belt, crossed her arms. "Amanda Jacobs?" Her voice was crisp, professional. "You're coming with us." Amanda's pulse skyrocketed. "What? No, I was just fired." "You don't need, this isn't about your termination," the officer cut in coldly. "You are under investigation for the mistreatment of a vulnerable passenger, as well as violating multiple airline policies. We've already received direct orders from the airline's legal team. You'll need to answer some questions." Amanda's breath hitched. Legal team? Then it hit her they were going to sue. Walter Langston hadn't just been a passenger. He was the heir to the airline, and she had given him every reason to destroy her. Her legs went weak. You can't be serious," she whispered. The officer gave a tight, humorless smile. "Oh, we are." She gestured toward the terminal doors. "Let's go." With cameras still rolling, Amanda was escorted out of the airport like a criminal. Videos of her downfall flooded social media. Within hours, millions of people had seen the moment she lost everything. 1 year later, the smell of greasy food and burned coffee lingered in the air. Amanda adjusted the cheap apron around her waist and forced herself not to cry. She had spent the last 12 months blacklisted from the airline industry, rejected from every job she applied for. Nobody wanted to hire the woman who made international headlines for torturing a dying man. Now, she worked behind the counter of a rundown diner, taking orders from people who recognized her face. She delivered a plate of cold eggs and watery coffee to a man sitting at the counter. He smirked as she set it down. "Hey," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Aren't you that flight attendant?" Amanda's stomach twisted. "No," she muttered. "Yeah, you are." His grin widened. "Man, you really screwed up, huh? Thought you were better than everyone else. Now look at you." Amanda clenched her fists. She turned to walk away, but the man called after her, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Hey, can I get a different seat? You know, since you're such an expert at switching them." Laughter erupted around her. Someone pulled out their phone to record. Amanda wanted to scream, but she didn't. She just kept walking, trapped in the world she had created for herself. The same way Walter had been. The end. Tell us where you're watching from. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another shocking tale. See you in the next one.